My husband signed our prenup with a smile, because he was certain he'd never need it. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to learn in 9 years of marriage, was that the penthouse he bragged about, the company he ran, and the bank accounts he drained for his mistress were all sitting under one name. And it wasn't his. So when he stood up at his own birthday party, in front of 300 people, and raised a glass of champagne, and announced that he was ready for the next chapter of his life, I raised my glass too. Because I was holding the deed to his next chapter, and the lease was up. He smiled at me across that ballroom like a man who had already won. He had no idea that the most dangerous person in the room was the wife he'd stopped seeing years ago. He thought I was the audience. He never once considered that I might be the one holding the script. But to understand how I ended up smiling in a room full of people who thought I was the fool, I have to take you back. 6 weeks back. To a Tuesday morning and a slip of paper in a coat pocket, and the exact moment the floor I had trusted my whole life went quietly out from under me. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. And I'll ask you again at the very end, because I'm curious whether your answer changes once you know everything I knew. When a man builds a secret life with another woman and pays for all of it with his wife's money and never finds out the money was hers, and she lets him finish building it before she pulls the floor out, is she cold? Or did he earn every second of what's coming? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, type the word hush. Let's see how many of us are out there. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened. My name is Alina Vance. Everyone calls me Nora. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 12 years I've built and run a commercial real estate firm in Manhattan called Meridian Holdings. We buy distressed buildings, restore them, and lease them to the kind of tenants who pay on time and never call at midnight. It is quiet, unglamorous, deeply profitable work. I started it with a small inheritance from my grandmother and a stubbornness I inherited from no one. I am very good at 3 things: reading a contract, reading a room, and waiting. Remember that last one. It matters more than anything else in this story. My husband, Marcus Vance, was good at exactly one thing. He was good at being looked at. I met him 14 years ago at a charity gala, the kind of evening where men in rented confidence circle the women who actually have money. Marcus was charming in a way that felt like sunlight. Warm, total, and a little blinding. He crossed that whole room to talk to me, and he told me I was the most interesting woman in it, and back then, lonely, and tired of being the smartest person at every table. I let myself believe that being interesting to him was the same thing as being loved by him. It is not the same thing. It took me 9 years and 1 slip of paper to learn the difference. We married a year after that gala. I was 30, established, cautious, and quietly wealthy. My lawyer, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Diane Cho, who has stood beside me since the very beginning, insisted on a prenup. I remember Marcus laughing about it. He kissed my forehead and said, "Lock it all up, Nora. I'm not here for your money." And he signed every single page without reading one of them. That was the first true thing Marcus ever taught me about himself, though it took me years to understand the lesson. Marcus never read the fine print. He assumed the world had been arranged for his comfort, and so he never bothered to check the arrangements. He signed what was put in front of him. He believed what he was told. He lived on a stage and never once wondered who owned the building. There were signs in those early years. There are always signs. I just chose to read them as virtues because I wanted the story I was telling myself to hold. Marcus never asked what anything cost. Not the apartment, not the cars, not the trips. I told myself that was confidence. It was actually a man who had never once in his life been told no by the person paying. He spoke about money the way people speak about weather, something that simply happened around him, pleasant and constant, requiring no effort on his part. I found it charming. I was the one who arranged the weather, and I found his obliviousness charming. He liked being seen with me at the start, when Meridian was already established and my name opened doors. He liked the doors. Somewhere in year 3 or 4, he stopped liking that the doors were mine. He began to talk, at dinners, about his deals and his instincts and his vision, and I would sit beside him and let him, because I had learned young that a man will forgive you almost anything except being smaller than his wife in public. So I made myself smaller in public. That was my mistake, and I want to name it plainly, because this story isn't only about what he did. It's about what I allowed. I had built something real, and I spent years quietly handing him the credit for it, telling myself that generosity in a marriage flows in one clear direction and that mine would eventually be returned. I dimmed my own lights so his would look brighter. And a man who gets used to standing in borrowed light starts to believe the light is his. Here is the part that matters. When Marcus decided he wanted to run something of his own, I built it for him. I took a property management arm of Meridian, gave it a sleek name, Vance Property Group, and installed him as the public face and chief executive. I gave him the corner office, the company car, the title on the door. He took clients to lunch at the Polo Bar. He posted online about the grind. He told people at dinner parties that he had built a portfolio from nothing. What he never mentioned, because I genuinely think he had managed to forget it, was that Vance Property Group was a wholly owned subsidiary of my company. I owned 96% of it. The 4% I handed Marcus came wrapped in a clause Diane had written, the kind of clause a man like Marcus signs without reading. The kind that matters enormously, exactly once, on exactly the wrong day for him. I should tell you about the dinners, because the dinners are where I first felt the marriage start to rot, long before I had a word for what I was watching. We hosted often. Marcus loved hosting. He loved a long table, good wine, an audience that had to stay seated through dessert. And somewhere around the 5th year, I noticed a habit forming in him that I chose, at the time, to forgive. He had started telling our story without me in it. He would lean back at the head of the table, in my home, and talk about how he had clawed his way up. How he had a nose for undervalued buildings. How he had taken risks other men were too soft to take. Our guests would nod, impressed, and I would sit at the other end and watch a man describe my entire career as if it were a memoir he had written himself. Once, a banker I'd known for years caught my eye across the candles, and I saw the small flicker of confusion on his face. He knew whose company it was. He said nothing. People rarely do. It is astonishing what a room full of polite adults will let a confident man get away with. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself a man needs to feel like the hero of his own life, and what did it cost me, really, to let him borrow a few stories at a dinner party? But that is exactly how it starts. You let him borrow the stories, and then the credit, and then the sense that he is the one keeping the lights on. And a man who has been allowed to believe he built everything will, eventually, decide he is allowed to take everything. The dinners were the rehearsal. I just didn't know, yet, what play we were rehearsing for. What I know now is that every time I stayed quiet at the foot of my own table, I was teaching him the most dangerous lesson a man like Marcus can learn, that my silence was free, and that it would always be there. The penthouse on Central Park West, the one in every photograph of his perfect life, I bought it before we married. It sits in my name, inside a trust I control. Marcus paid for nothing in our life. Not the home, not the cars, not the staff. He earned a salary I set from a company I owned, and he spent it like a man who believed the well had no bottom. I want you to sit with how strange that arrangement was, looking back. For 9 years, a grown man lived inside a life where every single thing he touched belonged to his wife, and he never noticed. He never asked to see a deed. He never read a single statement past the balance. He never wondered, not once, what would happen to any of it if the marriage ended, because in his mind, the marriage was a thing that happened to me, a thing I needed, a thing I would never risk. That is the quiet arrogance that undoes men like Marcus. Not cruelty, incuriosity. He could not imagine that the woman pouring his wine had read every line of the contracts he'd signed blind. He could not imagine that being underestimated, for a patient woman, is not an insult. It's an advantage. It's a door left unlocked. For 9 years, I let him believe it. I told myself it was love. I told myself that a marriage where one person handles the money and the other handles the charm is just a division of labor. I told myself that my husband's comfort was a thing worth building, brick by brick, out of my own work. I was very, very good at telling myself things. It is, I have since decided, the most dangerous talent a competent woman can have, the ability to explain away exactly what she is seeing. And then, 6 weeks ago, I ran out of explanations. Because 6 weeks ago, I found the receipt. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary one. I was emptying the pockets of his charcoal blazer before sending it to the cleaner. It's a small thing, that habit, the kind of invisible work that quietly holds a household together, the kind no one ever thanks you for. And my fingers closed on a slip of paper folded into the inner pocket. A receipt, Bemelman's bar at the Carlisle. 2 old fashions, a bottle of Krug, a cheese plate, $340, dated the previous Thursday. The previous Thursday. The Thursday Marcus had told me, over breakfast, that he was flying to Boston to close a deal. I had packed his bag myself. I had reminded him to take his allergy medication. I had kissed him at the door and told him to call me when he landed, and he had, from an airport that I now understood he had never been standing in. I stood there in our enormous closet, holding that little piece of paper, and I felt the first cold thing move through me. It wasn't heat. It wasn't tears. It was cold, clean, and quiet, like a window opening somewhere in a winter house. A draft you feel before you find its source. I did not confront him. I need you to understand that, because it is the single most important decision I made in this entire story. I have spent my whole career learning one hard truth. The worst thing you can do with a piece of information is let the other person know you have it. Information is only powerful while it stays secret. The moment you reveal it, you trade a weapon for the brief, useless pleasure of watching someone flinch. And I had no interest in a flinch. I wanted the whole structure. So I folded the receipt back up and I put it in my own pocket. I sent the blazer to the cleaner. And that night, I made his favorite dinner, seared branzino, exactly the way he likes it, and I asked him warmly how Boston had been. He loosened his tie and dropped into his chair. "Brutal," he said. "These guys negotiate like it's a blood sport. I'm exhausted, babe." "Poor thing," I said, and I refilled his wine. He smiled at me then. That sunlight smile, completely at ease, completely certain of the woman across the table and the life around him. He told me a long, detailed, entirely invented story about a Boston conference room and a difficult counterpart who wouldn't budge on terms. He was good at it. That was the thing that chilled me most, sitting there nodding, not that he lied, but how easily, how richly, how comfortably he lied, with specifics and texture and a little self-deprecating laugh at the end. This was not a man's first lie. This was a man who lied the way other people breathe. And I smiled back, and somewhere behind my own eyes, a door I had kept shut for 9 years clicked quietly open. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw the branzino at the wall. Screaming is what you do when you have run out of other options. And I had options. I had options Marcus could not even imagine, because to imagine them, he would have had to read the fine print of his own life, and he never, ever did. I was going to find out everything, and then I was going to use it. People expect betrayal to feel like falling. Mine felt like landing. For 9 years, I had been carrying a low, constant hum of effort. The work of being chosen. The work of being interesting. The work of keeping a charming man comfortable enough that he would decide, each morning, to stay. And the moment I understood that he had not stayed, that he had been gone for who knows how long, while I stood in the doorway holding it open and calling it love, the hum simply stopped. In its place was a silence so complete it was almost luxurious. I remember lying in bed that night, listening to Marcus breathe beside me and feeling my own pulse. Slow, even, certain. I was not planning revenge yet. I was doing something colder and far more useful than revenge. I was taking inventory. The house, mine. The company, mine. The accounts he drew from, mine, or joint accounts that I funded and could see to the penny. The prenup. Ironclad because I had paid, years ago, to make it ironclad. Marcus had spent nearly a decade standing on a stage I built, mistaking the spotlight for solid ground beneath his feet. A man who cheats on a woman he believes needs him is a coward. That's an ordinary kind of ugly. But a man who cheats on a woman who quietly owns everything he touches, and who never once bothered to find out, That man is something rarer. He is a tenant who has stopped paying rent and forgotten that the landlord still has a key. I did not cry that night. I keep waiting when I tell this story to reach the part where I cried. There isn't one. I lay there in the dark and I made a list in my head the same way I do before any acquisition. What do I have? What do I need? What is the timeline? Who do I call first? By the time the city went gray with morning, the list was finished. And the Our resty name on it wasn't Marcus. It was Diane. I got up before the alarm. I made coffee. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of a penthouse that had been mine since before I'd ever heard his name, and I watched the sun come up over a park, over a city where I quietly own more than my husband would ever guess. And I felt, for the first time in years, completely awake. The grief would come later, in small, manageable pieces on my own schedule. That morning there was only clarity, and a plan beginning to assemble itself, piece by patient piece. There was one more thing I did before I called Diane, and it is the thing I am, in a strange way, proudest of. I did not change a single habit. Not one. The next morning I made his coffee the way I always had, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and I set it by his side of the sink while he showered. I asked him what he wanted for dinner that week. I laughed at his joke about the doorman. I let him kiss the top of my head on his way out, and I said, "Have a good day." And I meant it to sound exactly the way it had sounded for 9 years, because the whole strategy depended on him feeling watched by no one. It is harder than it sounds, that kind of stillness. Every cell in your body wants to react. Every instinct says confront, demand, weep, throw the receipt on the table and watch him scramble. I felt all of it. I just refused to spend it. Because I had learned, over 20 years of closing deals across from men who underestimated me, that the person who reacts first loses the most. Reaction is information. Every time you flinch, you hand the other side a map of where it hurts. I was not going to hand Marcus anything. So I became, for 6 weeks, the best actress I have ever been. The loving, slightly oblivious wife. The woman too busy with her own work to notice her husband's late nights and sudden business trips. He thought he was managing me. He thought the quiet meant I suspected nothing. He had it exactly backward. The quiet was the sound of a trap being built around him, board by silent board, in a workshop he didn't know existed. And the morning after I left Diane's office, when Marcus mentioned over breakfast that he'd be at his usual Saturday squash game, I smiled and told him to have fun, and I made a note of it. Because Saturday was when I would sit down with 24 months of statements, alone, in a quiet house, and finally start reading the fine print he never had. Diane Cho's office is on the 38th floor of a building my company does not own. That is the only reason she agreed to rent it. She likes, she says, to have one thing in her life that I cannot repossess. She is 63 years old. She wears the same 3 black suits in rotation. And in 20 years, she has never once told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. It is the most valuable quality a person can have, and almost no one has it. I told her about the receipt, the Boston lie, the 9 years. She did not gasp. She took off her glasses, cleaned them slowly on a cloth she keeps in her desk drawer, and put them back on. Then she folded her hands and looked at me. "All right," she said. "What do you want? And don't tell me you want to feel better. I'm not a therapist. Tell me the outcome you want, and I'll tell you how to get it." That question, "What outcome do you want?" is the most clarifying thing anyone has ever asked me. It cut straight through the grief I was supposed to be feeling and went looking for the part of me that builds things. "I want him out," I said. "I want it clean. And I want to know everything, all of it, before he knows anything at all." Diane nodded slowly. "Then here is the rule, and you are going to want to break it, so I am only going to say it once. You do not confront him, you do not hint, you do not change one thing about how you act at home. Confrontation feels like power, Nora. It isn't. It's a warning shot. The second a man like Marcus knows you're looking, he hides the money, he hires his own lawyer, and he starts building his version of the story. Right now, he thinks he's winning. That, believe me, is the single most useful thing in the world. A man who thinks he's winning gets sloppy. He gets comfortable. He leaves receipts in his coat pockets." She leaned forward across the desk. "We track 3 things. Money, every dollar that moves out of any account he can reach. Behavior, every lie with a date written next to it until a pattern becomes a record. And exposure, anything that shows him presenting himself out in the world as a free and unattached man. We do not react to any of it. Not once. We collect. And when we have gathered enough that not one piece of it can be argued away, then and only then do we act, all of it, at once. In a place and a moment where he cannot recover. I picked up my pen and wrote a single word in my notebook. Hush. Stay quiet, gather everything. And then I asked, Diane Almo. Sent smiled. It is a rare and frightening thing, a Diane Cho smile. And then you tell, she said. Once. In the one place where it does the most damage and gives him no time at all to spin it. I underlined the first word, and beneath it I wrote a second one because somehow I already knew the shape of the ending. Tell. That was the entire strategy, the whole plan in 2 words, hush, then tell. We sat for another hour, the two of us, mapping it out like any other deal. Diane is not a sentimental woman, and that morning I needed someone unsentimental more than I needed comfort. She asked hard questions. Did I want the marriage saved? No. Did I want money from him? He had none that wasn't mine. Did I want him hurt, or did I want him handled? And I sat with that one for a long moment because the honest answer mattered. I did not want to hurt Marcus for the pleasure of it. I wanted the truth placed in front of every person whose opinion he had ever traded on, all at once, and I wanted to be standing perfectly still in the center of it when it landed. Handled, then. Completely. I drove home that morning through a city I had quietly owned pieces of for 20 years, and for the first time since I'd found the receipt, I felt something other than cold. I felt focused. I had a man who thought he was winning, a lawyer who had never lost, and 6 weeks until a birthday party I had not yet decided to throw. By the time I reached my own front door, I had decided. Saturday came, and the house was finally empty. Marcus left for his squash game a little after 9, gym bag over his shoulder, and the moment the elevator doors closed behind him, I sat down at the long table in my study with 24 months of statements and a fresh pot of coffee. I want you to understand my state of mind. I was not frantic. I was not shaking. I felt the way I feel before I open the books on a building I'm about to buy. Calm, methodical, a little curious. I was an investor doing due diligence on a deal I had already decided to close. I started with the money because money never lies and money never forgets. People are sentimental about a lot of things. Money is the one thing in a marriage that keeps an honest record. You can lie to a wife. You cannot lie to a bank statement. Every dinner, every gift, every night spent somewhere you said you weren't. It all leaves a mark, dated and itemized, waiting patiently for someone to finally sit down and read it. Marcus had a personal card I had given him years ago, attached to an account I funded every month, the way you'd fund any executive's expenses. For 9 years, I had glanced at those statements maybe twice a year, around tax season, and waved them through because I trusted him. Which is a polite way of saying I never actually looked. That morning, I looked. The pattern was almost insulting in how obvious it was. Bemelman's bar, again and again. The Carlyle. A jeweler on Madison Avenue. A women's boutique in Soho where a single dress costs more than most people pay in rent. Dinners for 2 at restaurants Marcus had never once taken me to. And, threaded through all of it, recurring charges to an address on the Lower East Side that I did not recognize. The amounts told their own story, and it was a story with a clear, ugly arc. 2 years ago, it was a few $100s a month, small enough to lose in the noise, then a few thousand. Then, in the last 6 months, real money, $11,000 one month, $14,000 the next, $18,000 in a single 30-day stretch. The line on the graph only went one direction, and I knew that direction. I had watched it in 100 businesses. It is the shape of something that started as an indulgence and became a commitment. I built a spreadsheet. I am, at my core, a woman who answers pain by building a spreadsheet. Every charge, every date, every category. And then I did the thing that turned a suspicion into a case. I laid his business trips beside his spending, side by side, date against date. Boston, he had told me. He was at the Carlyle. A conference in Chicago, he had said, the week of our anniversary. He was at a resort 2 hours up the coast in the Hamptons, a closing in Philadelphia, dinner for two in the West Village. Line after line, his lies stacked up neatly against the truth in columns in my own handwriting. And what I understood, looking at that spreadsheet, was that this was not a man having an affair. An affair is a moment of weakness. This was a man running a second, parallel life. A whole separate existence with its own restaurants and its own rituals and its own rhythm, and billing every dollar of it to me. That was the first thing I learned for certain. It was not a fling, it was an institution. The second thing came from that address, on the Lower East Side. I am in real estate. Finding out who lives where is, for me, less an investigation than an ordinary Tuesday. It took one phone call and 20 minutes. The recurring charges were rent. Marcus was paying $2,200 a month on a one-bedroom apartment, and the lease was in the name of a woman called Sienna Marsh. I knew that name. That was the part that made me set down my coffee. Sienna Marsh was the events coordinator that Vance Property Group had hired about 18 months earlier. 28 years old. I had met her exactly once at the company holiday party, where she had shaken my hand and called me Mrs. Vance and looked at me with a particular kind of sweetness. The sweetness of a young woman who already knows something you don't and is enjoying it. I had thought, at the time, what a poised girl. I had no idea I was shaking hands with the woman my husband was housing on my money. My husband was paying the rent for his mistress, with my money, on an apartment that, through a long, quiet chain of ownership, I was in a roundabout way financing myself. I sat with that for a moment, and I felt the cold thing in my chest turn, very slightly, into something with an edge. I want to be honest about what I felt, sitting there. It was not jealousy. Jealousy is hot, and what I felt was cold. It was closer to insult, the specific insult of being managed by someone who thought he was smarter than me. He had hidden this in plain sight, in statements he assumed I would never read, in a company he assumed I would never audit, behind a name he assumed I would never recognize. Every assumption was a small bet that I was exactly as inattentive as he needed me to be. And every one of those bets was about to come due. But I did not stop. Diane's rule lived in my head like a second pulse. Collect until it cannot be argued. So I kept reading, deeper into the company books, into the places a man who never reads the fine print would never think to hide things, because he could not imagine anyone bothering to look. The third thing was the one that changed the whole nature of what I was holding, because the third thing was not a betrayal. It was a crime. I went into the company books. I own the company. I am allowed. And buried inside the Vance Property Group expenses, approved month after month under Marcus's own signature, were payments to a consulting firm called SM Strategy LLC. $8,000 a month for marketing consulting. With no contract anyone could produce, no deliverables, no reports, no work product of any kind. Just $8,000 every month, flowing out of my company to a vendor that did nothing. SM Strategy. I looked at those initials for a long time. SM, Sienna Marsh. He had set up a shell company. He had created a fake vendor, given it a professional-sounding name, and was funneling money out of my business through that empty shell and into his mistress's bank account. Do you understand what that is? That is not heartbreak. That is not a marriage falling apart. That is embezzlement. That is wire fraud. That is a man committing a serious crime against a company. A company he did not know, had never bothered to learn, was 96% owned by the wife he was stealing from. I sat back in my chair and looked out at the city lights coming on across the park, and for the first time I let myself feel something other than cold. I felt the edge sharpen into a tool, because a betrayal you survive. A betrayal you grieve and you heal and you move past. But a crime, a documented, signed, dated crime, a crime you can use. A crime does not care how charming you are. A crime does not soften because you have a good jawline and an easy laugh and a room full of people who like you. A crime is a fact, and facts do not negotiate. Marcus had spent his whole life talking his way out of things. He was about to meet the one kind of trouble that does not listen to talking. I told Diane that night, on the phone, in a voice so level it almost frightened me. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the words I will never forget. "Nora, he didn't just break your heart. He handed you a weapon and signed it." But I still wasn't finished. Because the next morning, while Marcus slept off another late dinner with a client who did not exist, I went back to the SM strategy payments and traced where the money had pooled. And that is when I found the fourth thing, the one I think about most. Alone, 3 months earlier, Vance Property Group had made a loan to SM Strategy LLC, a large one. And SM Strategy had used that money, my money, laundered through a shell, lent to itself as a down payment on a property in Tribeca. Not the one-bedroom on the Lower East Side. Something new, something bought, not rented. A 2-bedroom condominium. I sat very still when I saw the listing. A 2-bedroom. A man does not buy a 1-bedroom Mistress a 2-bedroom future unless he intends to move into it. That apartment was not a love nest. It was an exit. Marcus was building himself a door out of our marriage, furnished and paid for, so when he finally walked through it, he would land softly. In a home he believed he owned, with a woman he believed he had chosen freely, telling everyone some gentle story about how he and Nora had simply grown apart. What struck me most was the patience of it. This was not a man losing his head over a younger woman. This was a man planning. He had thought about the months ahead, about where he would live, about how the story would sound. He had been careful and deliberate and slow, and somehow that was worse than passion would have been. Passion is human. This was administrative. He had been quietly processing me out of my own life like a contract he intended to let lapse. He had kept me, I realized, the way you keep a credit card you are about to max out and cancel. And then the last piece arrived without my looking for it at all, which is how the most important pieces almost always come. There is a young woman at the company named Priya. Sharp, observant, junior, the kind of person who notices everything and says little. Sienna Marsh kept a private social media account, and she had, at some point, let Priya follow it, a small vanity, the kind of thing you do when you want a wider audience for your good fortune. And one morning Priya saw something on that account that troubled her enough to take a screenshot, and after what I am sure was a long and uncomfortable internal debate, forward it to me, with one line. "I thought you should see this. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Vance." I almost didn't open it. I was tired, and some part of me already knew that whatever was in that message would be the last small piece, the one that closed the circle. I opened it anyway. You always open it. It was a photograph of a hand. A woman's hand, resting on a white tablecloth holding a glass of champagne, and on the ring finger of that hand was a diamond. A large one, emerald cut. The kind of ring you do not buy a woman you intend to keep a secret. The caption was 3 words, "He said yes." He said yes, as though she had proposed to him, as though it were charming. My husband, still legally married to me, the man who had kissed my forehead that very morning and asked what I wanted for dinner, had gotten himself engaged to the woman he was funding by stealing from my company. I forwarded the photo to Diane. She called me back in 90 seconds. "Tell me you didn't reply to her," Diane said. "No hello, just that." "I didn't reply to anyone," I said. "Good," I heard her exhale. "Because now we have all of it. We have adultery, which your prenup punishes. We have financial fraud against a company you own, which is a crime the state prosecutes whether you want them to or not. And we have a man publicly presenting himself as engaged while he is married, the kind of thing that ends a reputation in a single afternoon, in front of exactly the people he spent his life performing for." She paused. "So, how do you want to do it?" I looked at that photograph for a long moment. The hand, the ring, the smug little caption. And I thought about 9 years of seared branzino and refilled wine, and poor thing, you must be exhausted. I thought about the dinners where he told my story as his own, and the door he was building out of my money, and the soft landing he had arranged for himself on the far side of my life. And I felt, settling over me, the cleanest calm I have ever known. I knew exactly how I wanted to do it. I knew the room. I knew the moment. I knew the faces I wanted in the chairs. "He has a birthday next month," I said. "I'm going to throw him a party." There was a long silence on the line. And then Diane Cho, who has never once in 20 years told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true, said the only thing there was to say. "Of course you are." I hung up the phone, and I began, very quietly, to plan the most beautiful party that city had ever seen. Here is the thing about a man who believes he is winning. He will help you build his own gallows, board by board, and thank you for handing him the hammer. I told Marcus I wanted to throw him a party for his 40th birthday. A real one. 300 people. Clients, partners, the entire board of Vance Property Group, 2 journalists from the financial press, and the whole shining circle of people whose good opinion was the only currency Marcus had ever truly cared about. I told him I wanted it to be the kind of night people talked about for a year. He was delighted. Of course he was. He pulled me into a hug and said, "You're the best, you know that." And I let him hug me, because a woman who is 6 weeks from winning can afford to be generous with her arms. "I want it to be unforgettable," I told him. "You always do too much," he said, fond and easy. "Not this time," I said. "This time I think I'll do exactly enough." He laughed. He did not hear it. That is the gift a confident man gives you over and over. He does not listen closely because he caw. And not imagine that anything aimed at him could possibly land. I had spent 9 years being talked over, and in those last 6 weeks I finally understood that being talked over is a kind of invisibility. And invisibility, used correctly, is the most powerful position in any room. He could not plan against a threat he could not see. And he could not see me, because he had stopped really looking years ago. For weeks I let him watch me choose linens and taste cakes and argue with the florist about peonies. I made a great show of it. I wanted him relaxed. I wanted him certain that the most his wife was capable of plotting was a seating chart. Every hour he spent believing I was harmless was an hour I spent making sure I was anything but. So I planned a party, and underneath the party, I planned the other thing. I booked the grand ballroom of a hotel I will not name, because the hotel did nothing wrong. I hired the caterer and the florist and a string quartet. I ordered a tower of champagne glasses stacked higher than a man. I sent 300 invitations, and I made sure every single person Marcus wanted to impress would be in that room, the investors he flattered, the board members he reported to, the 2 reporters whose attention he craved. I even invited one guest he did not know I had invited. A journalist from a financial outlet who had been asking me for an interview about Meridian for 2 years, and to whom I now, quietly, owed nothing, but who owed me her curiosity. And while I chose flowers, Diane and I built the file into a weapon. We prepared a complete forensic accounting of every dollar Marcus had routed through SM Strategy LLC. Every transfer, traced from my company, through the shell, into Sienna Marsh's account. Annotated. Dated. Notarized. We prepared a formal notice of his removal as chief executive of Vance Property Group, which I was entitled to sign the instant I chose, as the holder of 96% of its equity. We prepared divorce papers drawn precisely to the prenup he had signed without reading. The prenup that stripped him of any claim in the event of infidelity. Infidelity I could now prove with dates, in writing, beyond any argument. And we prepared one more thing. A single sealed envelope, addressed to Marcus in my own hand, to be delivered to him by a courier at a moment of my choosing. I will not tell you yet what was inside it. You will learn that when he did. The night before the party, I tried on the dress I had bought for it. Not white. White is for women who want to be forgiven, not red either. Red is for women who want to be looked at. I chose black. Deep, flat, matte black. A sharp, simple sheath with clean lines and no apology in it anywhere. When Diane had asked me what I planned to wear, I had said one word, armor, and she had nodded as though that were a complete and reasonable answer, which, between the 2 of us, it was. I stood in front of the mirror in that quiet penthouse, the one that had been mine since before I had ever heard the name Marcus Vance, and I looked at the woman looking back. 41 years old, calm, steady, wide awake. Not the woman who had spent 9 years dimming her own lights so a smaller man could look brighter. That woman was already gone. I had buried her, quietly, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, and I had not mourned her, because the woman standing in the mirror was the one I should have been the whole time. I thought standing there about all the versions of this night I could have chosen. The screaming version, the crying version, the version where I confronted him in our kitchen 6 weeks ago and gave him the chance to lie his way back in, the way he always had. I had wanted in the first raw hours to do it loud. But loud is what you reach for when you have nothing else. I had everything else. I had the deed and the books and the signatures and the law. Loud was beneath the woman in the mirror. She did not need volume. She had leverage. I said one word to my reflection, very softly. Hush. And then, softer still, I said the other one. Now we tell. The ballroom was perfect. I will give myself that. Gold light, white orchids on every table. The quartet playing something warm and forgettable. 300 of the most impressive people my husband knew, all of them holding glasses, all of them there to celebrate him. And moving through them like a man crossing a stage he believed he owned, there was Marcus. Handshakes, shoulder claps, that laugh that made everyone in earshot feel briefly chosen. Sienna Marsh was there too. I had put her on the guest list myself, under her professional title, Events Coordinator, a perfectly reasonable name on a corporate invitation. She came in a green dress and a careful smile, and no ring on her finger she had left at home, the discreet little fiancé, thinking she was being so careful. She had no idea she had not been invited. She had been cast. I watched her orc the room for a while, Sienna, in her green dress. She was good at it, gracious with the older investors, warm with the wives, careful never to stand too close to Marcus for too long. She thought she was being invisible. She had no idea that I had been watching her be invisible for weeks, that I knew the rhythm of her caution better than she did. There was a moment, early in the evening, when she caught me looking, and she gave me the small, polite smile of a junior employee acknowledging the boss's wife. I gave it right back to her. Mrs. Vance, her smile said. Enjoy your evening, mine said. Neither of us knew, in that instant, or rather, only one of us knew, that within the hour her whole future would be lying in pieces on a ballroom floor. Marcus found me near the champagne tower and kissed my temple. This is incredible, Nora, he murmured. You really outdid yourself. I really did, I agreed. And I waited, because the only thing left to do was let him climb the last few steps himself. At 9 o'clock, exactly as I had arranged, the quartet went quiet and the lights came up a touch, and a microphone found its way into my husband's hand. A man like Marcus never met a microphone he did not believe was his birthright. He gave a charming little speech, thanked everyone for coming, made a joke about turning 40, about his knees, about his barber. And then, because the universe occasionally arranges these things better than I ever could have, he got sentimental. You know, he said, swirling his champagne, 40 feels like a turning point, like the start of a whole new chapter. And I just want to say, to everyone in this room, I have never felt more sure about my future. I have never felt more ready for what comes next. He raised his glass to 300 people. And across the room, before she could stop herself, Sienna Marsh smiled. I watched a few of the sharper guests catch it, that small private current that runs through a crowd when it senses something moving beneath the surface. And I set down my own glass, and I walked, unhurried, toward the stage. Marcus saw me coming and grinned, sure I was joining him for the toast. And of course, he said into the microphone, gesturing grandly toward me, none of this would be possible without my wife. Nora, come up here. So I did. I climbed the 2 steps to the stage, and he handed me the microphone with a flourish, expecting, I am certain of this, that I would say something warm and gracious and make him look even better than he already did. I took the microphone, and I looked out at 300 faces. I found the reporter near the back, pen already moving. I found Sienna in her green dress. I found Diane by the door, calm as still water, and beside her the courier, holding a sealed envelope. Thank you all for coming, I said. My voice was perfectly level, and the room went quiet to hear it. My husband is right. Tonight really is the start of a new chapter for him, and I think everyone here deserves to hear about it, because I have worked very hard to make sure it happens exactly the way it should. Marcus chuckled beside me, basking. Marcus said he has never felt more sure about his future, I went on, and I believe him. Because for the last 6 months, he has been planning it very carefully. A new apartment in Tribeca, 2 bedrooms, an engagement ring from a jeweler on Madison Avenue, a whole new life. The chuckle on his face began, very slowly, to set, like concrete in cold weather. The only detail he got wrong, I said, is who has been paying for it. I did not shout. I have never once in my life solved a problem by shouting. I reached into the small clutch at my side, and I took out a single folded page, and I unfolded it in front of the microphone so the paper crackled across the speakers and filled that silent room. This is a forensic accounting, I said, of $312,000 moved over the last 18 months out of Vance Property Group, through a shell company called SM Strategy LLC, into the personal bank account of a woman named Sienna Marsh. The green dress in the crowd went very, very still. Some of you in this room sit on the board of Vance Property Group. Some of you are investors in it, so you will want to know that these payments were fraudulent. There was no consulting. There were no deliverables. There was an affair and a man using company funds to pay for it. That is not a private matter between a husband and a wife. That is a crime. Marcus lunged for the microphone. Nora, stop. This is insane. You're embarrassing yourself. I took one clean step back, out of his reach, and kept my eyes on the room. He is going to tell you I am a jealous wife making a scene, I said, calm and clear. So let me give you the part he does not know. Marcus has spent 9 years telling all of you that he built Vance Property Group. He did not. I did. Vance Property Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of my company, Meridian Holdings. I own 96% of it. Marcus owns 4%, under a clause that dissolves the moment he is removed for cause. The sound that moved through that room was not a gasp. It was lower than a gasp, and far worse for him. It was the sound of 300 people, all at once, quietly revising everything they had ever believed about the man standing next to me. Marcus had gone the color of paper. The penthouse he is so proud of, I said, the one in every photograph of his perfect life, it is mine. I bought it before we married. It sits in my trust. The salary he has been spending on champagne and rent and a ring for his fiancée, I set that salary and I pay it out of a company I own. For 9 years, my husband has been living a life he believed was his, standing on a floor he believed he had built. I watched it travel across his face in stages, the way I had imagined it would, lying awake those 6 weeks. First the confusion, the small frown of a man hearing words that do not yet add up. Then the recognition, as the numbers and the names slid into place and he understood that I was not bluffing, that I had the documents, that I had had them for some time. And then, last and worst for him, the public horror. The moment he remembered that 300 people were watching this happen to him, that the investors were watching, that the reporters were writing, that there was no version of tomorrow in which this had not occurred. I let that hang in the air for 1 full second. It was a stage, I said, and I am the one who owns the building. That was the moment. I nodded once, toward the door. And across that silent ballroom, the courier walked the length of the room and placed the sealed envelope into Marcus's shaking hands. Open it, I said. He tore it open. He pulled out the deed to the penthouse, and the corporate ownership records of the company he thought he ran, and a single note in my own handwriting. I watched his eyes drop to the note. I watched the last of the sunlight go out of him as he read it. I had written 4 lines. Marcus, you never read the fine print. You signed a prenup you did not read, ran a company you did not own, and built a future with money that was never yours. You are removed for cause, effective tonight. The locks change at midnight. Your things are in storage. The address is enclosed. Happy birthday, Nora. He read it twice. I watched him read it twice. And somewhere in the second reading, the performance that was Marcus Vance, the easy laugh, the warm certainty, the sunlight he had traded on for 40 years simply switched off, like a lamp at the wall. What was left was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, holding a piece of paper in a room full of people who had, until 90 seconds ago, admired him, and who now would not meet his eyes. He looked up from that note, and for the first time in 14 years, Marcus Vance had absolutely nothing to say. "You will be served the divorce papers on your way out," I told him. My voice was gentle now, almost kind. "The board will be in touch about the company, and the district attorney's office already has the accounting. Diane delivered it this afternoon, so whatever you are about to say to me, I would save it for your lawyer." I set the microphone down on the podium with a soft, final click. And then I turned to the room, to the board, the investors, the reporters, the 300 faces who would carry this night out into the world by morning. And I did the only graceful thing there was left to do. "Thank you all for coming," I said. "The bar is open. The champagne is paid for. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." And I walked off the stage. Past my husband, who did not try to stop me, there was nothing left in him to try with. Past the woman in the green dress, who was standing utterly alone now in a room that, 10 minutes earlier, had been the brightest place in her life. She looked at me as I passed, and for just a moment I saw something almost like a question in her face, as though she wanted me to explain, or to be cruel, or to give her something she could hold on to. I gave her nothing. Not cruelty, not pity. I simply walked by because she was not, and had never been, the point. Past 300 people who parted to let me through, the way a crowd parts for someone they have just decided not to cross. And out the tall doors that Diane was holding open for me, into the cool, clean dark of a city I had never, for one single day, stopped owning. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that I needed. People always want to know what happened to them afterward, so let me tell you, one at a time. Marcus first. The district attorney's office did not regard $312,000 of corporate fraud as a romantic misunderstanding. Because I own the company, and because I chose to press it, and because Diane had built a file that left nothing, not one comma, to argue, he was charged with grand larceny and wire fraud. His lawyer tried, the way they do, to paint it as an ugly divorce, a bitter wife, a personal matter blown out of proportion. But the wire transfers were real. The shell company was real. His signature was on every fraudulent invoice, in his own confident hand. There is no charm in the world that survives your own signature on a crime. He took a plea in the end to avoid something worse. He served 20 months. And he came out into a city that had, very quietly and very completely, closed every door to him. The clients were gone. The board was gone. The friends who had clapped at his speeches did not return his calls. The last I heard, Marcus was managing a small portfolio of buildings in another state, for a salary for someone else, which is to say, he ended up doing, for a stranger, the exact job he had spent 9 years pretending he had built for himself. He tried in the early days to reach me. Long messages, at first apologetic, then wounded, then bitter, then apologetic again, cycling through every register a cornered man has. He told me I had overreacted. He told me he had been planning to tell me. He told me, in one memorable message I did not answer, that I had destroyed the family, as though there had been a family, as though he had not quietly dismantled it himself, board by board, in restaurants I was paying for. I read them once, and I blocked the number. I felt no urge to reply. There was nothing he could say that the evidence had not already said better. He never did buy the apartment in Tribeca. He couldn't. The down payment was clawed back as stolen funds long before the closing. The 2-bedroom future he had built for himself with my money was sold to a stranger before he ever spent a night in it. I have wondered, occasionally, who lives there now, and whether they have any idea that their bright new home was once a man's plan to walk out of his marriage softly. I hope they are happy in it. Some rooms deserve a better story than the one they were bought for. Then Sienna Marsh. She was never charged. The prosecutors decided, probably correctly, that she had taken the money but had not engineered the scheme, and there is a difference in the eyes of the law between a thief and a thief's reward. But the SM strategy payments were recovered in full, which emptied the accounts she had come to think of as her future. And the engagement evaporated the very instant Marcus did, because a ring is a promise about a future, and Marcus no longer had one to promise. She left the city not long after. The last trace of her I ever saw was that same private account, gone silent, the engagement photograph deleted, the careful smile nowhere to be found. She had bet her whole young life on a man she believed was rich and free, and she had learned, in front of 300 people, that he was neither. I do not hate her. I find I do not think about her much at all. She wanted a life she had not built, and she reached for the nearest man who seemed to be offering one. What she got instead was a lesson, delivered in a green dress, in a room full of strangers. I suspect she will spend a long time learning it. And then there was the company itself. Vance Property Group became, simply, Meridian Property Group. I took his name off the door the week after the party. There was a small, satisfying ceremony to it, a man with a screwdriver, 20 minutes of work, and a name that had hung there for years simply gone, as though it had never been load-bearing at all. Because it never had been. I watched the value of the firm go up in the months that followed, which told me, with a clarity I found almost funny, exactly how much my husband had been worth to the thing he had spent 9 years claiming to have built. The clients who mattered stayed. The board, once the shock wore off, was quietly relieved. It turns out a great many people had wondered, for years, how the numbers and the man had ever fit together, and had been too polite to ask. The company did not miss him. That is the cruelest epitaph I can offer a man who built his whole identity on being indispensable. The moment he was gone, everything ran better. I promoted Priya, the young woman who had found the courage to forward me that photograph, knowing what it might cost her, knowing it might be unwelcome. I gave her a real role with a real future, and today she is one of the most capable people who works for me. Courage like that is rarer than talent, and I have never once regretted rewarding it. And the penthouse. The locks did change at midnight, exactly as the note promised they would. I stood at the window that first night, alone, in the home that had always legally, and actually, and in every way that counts, been mine. And for the first time in 9 years, the silence in those rooms did not feel like waiting. It felt like peace. It is a strange thing, to live for years inside a quiet you have mistaken for emptiness, and then one night to feel that same quiet turn, in your chest, into something that finally belongs to you. For 9 years, the silence in those rooms had been the sound of me waiting, waiting for him to come home, waiting to be chosen again in the morning, waiting for a marriage to become the thing I had told everyone it already was. That first night alone, the silence held none of that. It just held me, and the city lights, and a glass of good wine I poured for no one's benefit but my own. That was 2 years ago now. Meridian is larger today than it has ever been. We closed the biggest acquisition in the firm's history last spring, a portfolio of buildings I had been circling, patiently, for a decade. And I gave the keynote at an industry conference, in the same hotel, in a ballroom not far from the one where it all ended. 14 years earlier, I had stood at the back of a room exactly like that one, while a charming man crossed the floor to tell me I was the most interesting woman in it. This time, I was the one at the podium, and the whole room had come, not to look at me, but to hear what I had built. I did the interview, eventually, with that reporter, the one I had quietly invited to the party. It ran as a long, admiring profile about a woman who had built an empire, while everyone around her was busy underestimating her. It did not mention Marcus at all. I had decided, by then, that he had taken up quite enough of my story already. I am not going to tell you that I found a great new love and rode off into a sunset, because that is not quite how it went, and I promised you, at the very start, the truth. What I found was quieter than that, and better, and entirely mine. I found mornings that belonged to no one but me. Work I am proud of without having to hand the credit to anyone. A small, true circle of people, Diane, Priya, a few others, who earned their place in my life by being honest when honesty cost them something. I travel. I sleep through the night. And I no longer spend a single unit of myself trying to be interesting to a person who has not earned it. There is a man lately, slow and kind and entirely unimpressed by spectacle, a man who reads the fine print of his own life, which I have come to understand is the rarest and most attractive quality a person can have. He asked me, on one of our first evenings, what I did for a living, and when I told him, he asked a real question about it, and then another, and he listened to the answers. It is a small thing. It should not have moved me as much as it did. But I had spent 14 years married to a man who told my story as his own. And there is something quietly astonishing about sitting across from someone who simply wants to hear yours, and leave it yours. We will see. I am in no hurry at all. I spent 9 years rushing to hold a door open for someone who had already walked out of it. I have learned since to let things take exactly as long as they take. I keep one thing from that whole season of my life, not the receipt. I threw that away long ago. I keep the carbon copy of the note. The 4 lines I wrote to Marcus and sealed in that envelope. I keep it in a drawer in my office, not because I need reminding of what he did, but because of what it taught me about what I am. I am a woman who waits. I am a woman who watches. And I am a woman who, when she finally moves all at once, and not one moment before she is ready. For 9 years, I was afraid that being quiet was the same as being small. I had it exactly backward. The quiet was never the smallness. The quiet was the patience. The quiet was the inventory, and the planning, and the gathering of every single thing I would need. The quiet was just the long, still part of the story that comes before a woman decides, at last, to speak. So let me ask you again, the way I promised I would at the very beginning. A man built a secret life with another woman and paid for every piece of it with his wife's money and never once found out the money was hers. And the wife let him finish building it, and then she pulled the floor out in front of everyone all at once. Was she too cold, or did he earn every second of it? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I genuinely want to know if your answer changed between the start of this story and the end of it. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your patience for weakness, type the word hush down in the comments, and let's see how many of us are out there. This is Hush and Tell Stories, where we keep the secret, and then we tell it. If this one stayed with you, subscribe, and I will have another for you very soon. Until next time, stay quiet a little longer than they expect you to.